Carney was just invited to speak before the European Parliament. Not a courtesy call, not a symbolic gesture, a formal invitation extended in person by the President of the European Parliament at a summit that Canada had never been part of until this week. Let that land for a moment. The European political community was built as a European space, designed for European leaders, addressing European crises, no external actors, no exceptions. Canada just became the exception. And here is what I want you to understand before we go any further. This is not a story about a diplomatic visit. This is a story about a shift in how Canada is being read by the rest of the world and what that shift could mean for every economic and strategic decision Ottawa makes from this point forward. I am going to break down exactly what happened, why it happened now, and what comes next. Stay with me. To understand why this invitation matters, you need to understand what the European political community actually is and what it was never supposed to be. The EPC was established in May of 2022. The context was not abstract. Russia had invaded Ukraine 3 months earlier. Europe was facing an energy crisis, a refugee crisis, and a fundamental question about its own security architecture. Leaders needed a forum that was fast, flexible, and exclusively European, not NATO, not the G7. Something different, something that could move without the procedural weight of existing institutions. So they built it. 40-plus nations, no formal treaty, no binding mechanisms, but a room where the most consequential decisions in European politics could be discussed before they became official policy. That room was never designed to include Ottawa. Now here are the facts as they stand today. Prime Minister Mark Carney traveled to Armenia in May of 2025. This marks the first visit by a Canadian Prime Minister to Armenia since 2018. At the summit, Carney engaged directly with European heads of state and government, and during those engagements, the President of the European Parliament extended a direct personal invitation for Carney to address the Parliament referencing the precedent set by former Prime Minister Trudeau, but making clear that the current moment makes the invitation more urgent, not less. Canada was not an observer at this summit. Canada was a participant. That distinction matters more than it sounds. Here is why. Participation in the EPC is not automatic. It is not bureaucratic. There is no application process, no membership criteria. You are there because the existing members concluded that your presence adds something to the room that would otherwise be missing. That is a political judgment. And political judgments at this level do not happen by accident. So the question I want you to sit with is this. What did European leaders see in Canada, specifically in Canada under Carney, that led them to open a door they had kept closed to every non-European nation before this? Part of the answer lies in geography and resources. Canada holds some of the largest reserves of critical minerals on the planet. It is a major energy producer. It has deep Atlantic trade infrastructure and an existing free trade agreement with the European Union, the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, which has been provisionally in force since 2017. But geography and resources alone do not get you into this room. What gets you into this room is timing. And the timing here is inseparable from one variable that every leader at this summit is navigating simultaneously. That variable is the current state of the transatlantic relationship with Washington. I am not going to editorialize on that. I am going to show you the data. I am going to show you the specific policy decisions that have reshaped how European capitals are calculating their options. And then I am going to show you exactly where Canada fits into that recalculation. Because the invitation Carney received is not the beginning of this story. It is the result of one. Here is where most analysts stop. They report the invitation. They note the precedent. They call it historic, and they move on. I am not going to do that. Because if you stop at the surface, you miss the three variables that actually determine whether this moment becomes consequential or becomes a footnote. Let me show you each one. There is no treaty. There is no enforcement mechanism. No court, no tribunal, no sanction regime that flows from decisions made inside this forum. When Carney sat in that room, he was not signing anything. He was not committing Canada to any legally enforceable obligation, and neither was anyone else. So why does it matter? Why does it? Because the EPC operates on a different currency entirely, not legal obligation, political signal. And in geopolitics, a signal sent at the right moment, in the right room, to the right audience, can carry more weight than a treaty that takes 7 years to ratify. The invitation to address the European Parliament is where that signal becomes institutional. The Parliament is not a summit, it is a legislature. 720 elected representatives, 450 million constituents. When a foreign leader speaks before that body, the address enters the formal record of European democratic life. That is a different category of recognition entirely. The Parliament President referenced Trudeau's address as context for the invitation to Carney. On the surface, that framing positions Carney as a continuation of an established relationship, reasonable, familiar, low friction. But look more carefully. Trudeau addressed the European Parliament in 2022, in the immediate aftermath of the Ukraine invasion, during a moment of maximum transatlantic solidarity. The context was clear, the message was unified, the political cost was near zero. Carney would be addressing the Parliament in 2025. A fundamentally different moment, one defined not by unified solidarity, but by active economic tension between Europe and Washington. An address now carries a different interpretive weight. In Brussels, it reads as partnership. In Washington, it may be read as alignment. Those are not the same thing, and Ottawa will need to be precise about which message it is sending and to whom. I want to be clear, I am presenting this as an analytical possibility, not a prediction. One interpretation of Canada's deepening engagement with European institutions is that it functions as negotiating leverage, a signal to Washington that Ottawa has credible alternatives and is willing to develop them. Under this reading, the Armenia visit is less about Europe and more about recalibrating the bilateral dynamic with the United States. A competing interpretation is that Washington reads this engagement not as leverage but as defection. And if that reading takes hold in the current political climate, the response may not be diplomatic. It may be economic. Canada sends approximately 75% of its exports to the United States. That number does not move quickly. Trade infrastructure, supply chains, and regulatory alignment built over decades do not diversify in a single summit season, which means Carney is navigating a very narrow corridor, engaged enough with Europe to signal independence, careful enough with Washington to avoid triggering retaliation. That corridor exists, but it is not wide. And the next variable I am going to show you is what determines whether Canada can stay inside it. Let me translate something for you. When the Parliament President said, and I am quoting directly from the exchange, I would say that this is more than ever great if you could make it. That is not casual language. That is not a polite suggestion between acquaintances. In the vocabulary of institutional European diplomacy, that phrasing carries a specific meaning. It signals that the invitation has already been discussed internally, that there is political appetite behind it, that Carney's acceptance would serve a purpose beyond the ceremonial. You do not extend that kind of invitation in a public setting unless you are confident it will land well both in the room and on the record. So what is the purpose? Here is my reading. And I want to be precise, this is analysis, not fact. This is how I interpret the architecture of what just happened. The European Union is currently managing a fundamental stress fracture in its traditional security and economic assumptions. The transatlantic relationship that anchored European strategic planning for 7 decades is no longer operating on predictable terms. Tariff announcements with little warning, Trade frameworks revised unilaterally, the sense documented in European policy circles that long-term commitments from Washington carry shorter expiration dates than they once did. Europe is not looking to replace the United States. That is not realistic, and no serious analyst is suggesting it. But Europe is actively looking to thicken its web of reliable relationships, to build redundancy into its strategic architecture. Canada, English-speaking, G7 member, NATO ally, CETA partner, resource-rich fits that profile in ways that very few non-European nations do. Carney speaking before the Parliament gives European leadership a domestically visible moment to point to, a demonstration for their own publics that Europe is building forward, not just reacting. Mark Carney served as governor of the Bank of Canada from 2008 to 2013. He then served as governor of the Bank of England from 2013 to 2020. He sat at the center of the global financial response to the 2008 crisis. He helped architect the post-crisis regulatory framework that still governs major economies today. European financial and political leadership knows who he is, not because of the election in March of 2025, because of 15 years of institutional presence at the highest levels of global economic governance. When Carney speaks about economic risk, diversification, and long-term structural planning, European technocrats are not hearing a politician. They are hearing someone who speaks their language, precisely, fluently, without the usual diplomatic softening. That credibility is not transferable. It is specific to this person at this moment, and it explains why the invitation was extended now rather than at any previous point in the Canada-EU relationship. Here is what rarely gets mentioned in the coverage of this visit. The comprehensive economic and trade agreement between Canada and the European Union has been provisionally enforced since September of 2017. It covers tariffs on goods, services access, investment protection, and regulatory cooperation across a broad range of sectors. It is not a new agreement waiting to be negotiated. It is an existing legal framework waiting to be more fully activated. What a deeper political relationship between Ottawa and Brussels can do practically, measurably, is accelerate the utilization of CETA's existing provisions, increase the volume of trade flowing through channels that are already open, reduce the regulatory friction that currently limits uptake in sectors like financial services, professional credentials, and clean technology. In other words, the diplomatic signal Carney is sending in Armenia has a direct legal and economic translation, one that does not require new legislation, one that does not require Senate ratification in Ottawa or unanimous consent in Brussels. The architecture is already built. What this moment is about, if my reading is correct, is whether the political will now exists on both sides to actually use it. That question does not have a clean answer yet. But the invitation to address the European Parliament suggests that at least one side is ready to find out. Let me bring this down to ground level, because everything I have walked you through the summit, the invitation, the legal architecture of CETA, the strategic signaling, all of it exists at an altitude where the air is thin and the language is careful. Treaties, frameworks, institutional relationships. But here is the question that actually matters. What does any of this mean for the people who are not in that room in Armenia? Let me show you 3 pressure points where this shift, if it holds, translates into something measurable. Canada is one of the world's largest producers of oil, natural gas, and uranium. Europe, following the disruption of Russian energy supplies after 2022, has been actively diversifying its energy import base. Liquefied natural gas terminals have been built or expanded across Germany, the Netherlands, and Italy specifically, to accommodate non-Russian supply. Canada has not been the primary beneficiary of that diversification. Infrastructure constraints, specifically the absence of sufficient East Coast LNG export capacity, have limited how much Canadian energy can actually reach European markets. Here is the analytical point. A deeper Canada-EU political relationship does not build a pipeline. It does not construct an LNG terminal overnight, but it does create the political conditions under which infrastructure investment becomes easier to justify domestically on both sides. It changes the risk calculation for private capital. For workers in Alberta and Newfoundland, that is not an abstract observation. That is a conversation about whether the next generation of energy infrastructure gets built toward the Atlantic or not. CETA eliminated or reduced tariffs on a significant range of Canadian agricultural exports to the European Union: beef, pork, canola, wheat. The agreement created market access that previously did not exist. But access and utilization are not the same thing. The current utilization rate of CETA's agricultural provisions remains below its theoretical ceiling, partly due to regulatory compliance costs, partly due to logistical friction, partly due to the fact that American markets remain closer and cheaper to reach for most prairie producers. If the political relationship between Ottawa and Brussels deepens in a meaningful way, and I want to be precise, this is a conditional, not a certainty. The downstream effect could include dedicated government support for CETA market development, trade facilitation offices, regulatory alignment programs, the kind of institutional infrastructure that turns a trade agreement from a document into a functioning commercial relationship. For a wheat farmer in Saskatchewan, that is the difference between having a theoretical option and having a real one. I want to give you the other side, because responsible analysis requires it. Canada's economic relationship with the United States is not a policy preference. It is a structural reality built over decades of integrated supply chains, shared regulatory frameworks, and geographic proximity that no diplomatic summit can replicate. Approximately 75% of Canadian exports go to the United States. That number reflects not just trade policy, but physical infrastructure, manufacturing integration, and labor market connections that run through every major Canadian industry. Deepening the European relationship is strategically rational as a long-term diversification goal, but diversification has a cost. Compliance with EU regulatory standards, longer shipping distances, different certification requirements, transition timelines measured in years, not quarters. Here is the version of this story that does not make headlines. A Canadian manufacturer currently selling into the American market does not pivot to European markets because a prime minister attended a summit. That pivot requires capital investment, regulatory adaptation, and market development resources that small and medium-sized businesses, the backbone of the Canadian economy, may not have access to. The macro logic of what Carney is doing is sound. The micro reality of how that logic reaches an actual business, an actual worker, an actual household, that translation is slower, more complicated, and far less certain than any summit communique will acknowledge. That gap between the diplomatic signal and the economic reality on the ground, that is what I want you to hold in your mind as we look at what comes next. So where does this go from here? I am going to give you 3 scenarios, not predictions, not guarantees, analytically grounded possibilities based on the variables we have examined. Because anyone who tells you they know exactly how this plays out is not an analyst. They are a salesperson. Carney addresses the European Parliament. The visit generates measurable follow through accelerated CETA utilization, joint investment frameworks in critical minerals or clean energy, expanded regulatory cooperation. Ottawa manages the Washington relationship carefully enough that deeper European engagement is read as economic pragmatism rather than political realignment. Canada gradually builds a more balanced trade architecture without triggering a deterioration in its most important bilateral relationship. This is the scenario where Armenia 2025 gets remembered as a turning point. The invitation to the European Parliament remains on the table, but does not translate into substantive policy movement. Domestic political pressures in Canada, cost of living, housing, the next electoral cycle pull the government's attention inward. The European relationship deepens on paper but not in practice. CETA continues to be underutilized. The Armenia summit becomes a notable moment in a foreign policy biography rather than the beginning of a structural shift. This is the scenario where nothing broke, but nothing was built either. Washington interprets Canada's European engagement as a directional choice rather than a hedging strategy. Economic pressure increases. Ottawa faces a genuine decision point, not a rhetorical one, about where its primary strategic commitments lie. The diversification strategy that looked rational at a summit in Armenia becomes considerably more complicated when the cost of that strategy arrives in the form of trade friction with a partner that absorbs 3/4 of Canadian exports. This is the scenario that nobody in the room in Armenia was talking about, but it is the one that the numbers make impossible to ignore. Here's what I want to know from you. Which of these three scenarios do you think is most likely, and more importantly, why? Because the answer to that question depends entirely on what you believe about the durability of political will when economic pressure arrives. Leave your read in the comments. I want to see how this audience is thinking about it. If this kind of analysis grounded in facts, focused on mechanisms, not on noise, is what you are looking for, then subscribe to this channel. Because next, we are going inside CETA itself, the provisions that are sitting dormant, the sectors where the real opportunity is, and the specific clauses that could matter enormously if this political moment actually converts into economic policy. That video is coming. Do not miss it.